Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this third in the three-part series with Rabbi Justice Solomon and Rabbi Professor Saiman. It's been a really fascinating series so far, and a very opportunity for us in Sydney to hear discussions of this type, spanning the world of traditional learning and academic approaches to Jewish law, halacha, and the tradition. This evening's topic is where to next for Jewish law. And I'm looking forward to seeing where we go, because it could be in so many different directions. The issues that come across a rabbi's desk these days range from show us microphones to where do people of non-binary gender sit in shul. How do we cope with the issues of agunot, and how do we deal with the same-sex marriages? Just a huge area, number of areas that Jewish law is having to apply itself to. And so many different views and approaches to how that could and should be done. So really delighted to have Rabbi Justice Solomon with us again, and of course thanking again Rabbi Professor Saiman for joining us at such an early hour where he is, and looking forward to hearing the conversation.
Thank you, Rabbi Elton, and hello everyone. Seems I wasn't given the memo about the pink shirt for the final talk. Right, well, this is a big topic, and Rabbi Elton has, I think, rightly identified there are some very big issues. The ones that he mentioned are certainly at the forefront of the agenda. And I was going to start by saying there are some very big issues and some very relatively minor perhaps ritualistic issues, but nevertheless ones that weigh upon us. So we have the big issues, gender identity, same-sex marriage, women's issues, agunot, women in the public space in particular. And then there are the little ones that people, when you're a rabbi of a shul, you often get a lot of the smaller issues as well as the bigger issues, things like, why do we still have to keep kitniot? Why second day Yom Tov? Why is that still necessary? So there are big social issues. There are relatively smaller ritual issues. There's a whole gamut of issues. But I think before we discuss, and I'll come back, hopefully we'll come back to some of them, but I think before we can address individual issues, I think we need a conceptual understanding, you'll be pleased to know, not overly conceptual or esoteric, but a general framework in answering the question, well, how does Jewish law change? How does it reform with a small r? Or does it change? Can it reform? So that, I think, is the first question we need to address. I've got some thoughts, perhaps views, they might be better characterized, but let's first hear from Professor Saiman. How does Jewish law change or reform, or doesn't it? Professor Saiman.
Thank you. I'm still waking up, but you hit me over the head with the hammer on that one. So I think to start generally, and certainly when we compare it to secular law, so there's no halachic legislature at the moment. The Sanhedrin may have served that purpose and may still one day serve that purpose. But for the bulk of the time that we've been living with halacha, there is no centralized legislature. So the first thing to say is that it's not going to look the way law reform in the secular law works. There are, and there have been at times, more local sort of legislators, vadei kahal, and different sort of forms of communal, typically local councils or governing bodies or batei din or some combination of things like that have passed certain takanot, certain, we might call them forms of legislation, but they typically nibble at the edges rather than go directly at it. So if it happens, it is practice that takes hold. And in my view, once it takes hold in a community that the people sort of see themselves as respecting and wanting to belong to, and it becomes mushrash, it becomes sort of entrenched in that way of life, then then things sort of can evolve. What that means is that what I would call front door change, some sort of declaration that up until now we did X, or legislative change, and henceforth we do Y, is pretty rare. And very difficult, because you need the authority and the ability to sort of go at it straight away. I think the much more common form of change is sort of change that seeps up from underneath, that things start happening and moving slightly. And then at some point, like Theseus' ship, we have moved it a little bit, though it's very hard to point to the very moment where that happens.
Do you mean organically, by practice, by the practice?
Organically by practice, right. So right now, just describing how it is without talking about, the legitimation and whatnot. Now, I think here, particularly sitting in the contemporary era, we can't really have this conversation without thinking of the history of the last 150 or 200 years. In other words, very broadly, in the beginning of the 1800s or so in Germany, there was not small R reform, but capital R reform, which, to keep it simple, and I'm no expert on this history, was a movement to say, listen, we've got to reform Jewish law, Jewish practice, Judaism for the then modern era, and went and made a bunch of frontal changes to halachic practice and to Jewish.
Can I just interrupt for a second, because actually Professor Mark Shapiro has been giving a very long series on the rabbinic response to Reform Judaism, and the history of that actually is fascinating, because some of those reforms actually began in the way that you're suggesting that traditional reform begins. That is, there were changes at the margins that communities adopted, that rabbis wrote were acceptable in the circumstances. And in fact, even I think capital R Reform Judaism historically, according to Professor Shapiro, may have had such a beginning.
No, I think that's right, but it then kind of coalesced, and it's also how many things is that happening to, right? Is it happening to one thing here, or right? In other words, when you move them together, and in any event, leaving aside how it started, right? It then sort of became that. And as you suggested, we now call orthodoxy is a response to that.
Can you give an example, Professor? What's an example of that?
An example of what? I'm sorry.
Of this organic incremental reform.
Sure. Let me just finish this, and then I'll sneak back to it. So, that really created what we call orthodoxy, that sort of separation between those things. And then I would say, looking at it today, and I think today is quite even different than maybe 30 years ago in America. But those movements are not seen as successful. In other words, let's even talk about conservative Judaism. I think it's hard to make the case that they were able to create the types of communities they were envisioning, where Jewish law and Jewish practice and Jewish identity is a sort of central node and central aspect of life, but ever so slightly modified for, egalitarian norms, for Shabbat and the kind of suburban community, etc. And I think contemporary Orthodox halacha lives in that, particularly in the United States, lives in that shadow, and therefore is always afraid, in my view, somewhat rightfully afraid of, look, this has been tried. A sort of direct front door legislative way has been tried, and I think in the eyes of most, certainly Orthodox people, found wanting. And that doesn't answer any particular question.
Hold on, Professor Saiman, I'm going to pick you up there. So you're saying, in answer to my question, how does Jewish law change? You say it's not a declaratory frontal shift, it's an incremental organic shift. And where there has been declaratory frontal shift, such as with other denominations of Judaism, we see that has failed, because looking at historically, there have been, where we are today, or at least we've come to today, the non-Orthodox communities are shrinking and failing.
And let me just say, and
well,
even if
that's not a great, with respect, I'm not. That's a functional argument.
it is.
Okay, all right.
So, well, I'm just trying to set the table here. In other words, and even if you don't think that they have failed, right? It's very clear that Orthodoxy doesn't want to be that. So all I'm saying is that is setting the table, and I think establishing the frame of reference through which people, both rabbinic and lay, are operating. That's really all I want to say.
When you say Orthodoxy doesn't want to be that, is that because Orthodoxy can't be that because we don't have the machinery for that? Or is it because we really don't want to be that? Because from my point of view, I'm not sure that we don't want to be that. I'm not sure that we don't want machinery for declaratory and functional and frontal change. It's just that we can't do it. So it's a b'diavad situation where we have.
So when you say can't, what do you mean by can't?
Well, we can't because we don't have a central legislature. And therefore, we fall back on this organic incremental concept reform that you're speaking of. And it's one thing to say, well, those who have tried something more radical have failed. But
let me answer this way. In other words, because I want to put together that if we had a central legislature, right, that was accepted upon everyone, then we would, in that imagined world, I think we would also feel safer saying here yes, here no, right? Okay. So I don't think these things are disconnected. In other words, part of what you're saying is we don't, what do you mean can't? I mean, we could, people just like, conservative and reform Judaism did, it is possible, it is not physically impossible, but it is religiously, emotionally, spiritually hard, difficult, impossible, inauthentic. So the only reason I want to bring that in is because, in my view, whether acknowledged or not, conversations on these questions are always on that backdrop. And in America, we could talk about Israel in a minute, and always on the backdrop of the mass assimilation seen in the United States emerging out of those movements. And that just adds extra pressure and extra anxiety and extra sensitivity to what I would call frontal changes. The other point I'd make is that not all issues are the same. The ones Rabbi Elston mentioned and that you've sort of are the most sensitive and the most controversial and the scariest when it comes to halachic change. If we talk a little bit leveraging on what we talked about last week, changes in the way commercial and business, halacha and law interact, if we think about the changes to the Jewish practice and Jewish imagination brought by Zionism and the State of Israel, we can find other areas that or even approaches to evolution and what the first couple prakim chapters of Genesis means. These are areas where once they may have been great sources of tension and anxiety, particularly the last two, Zionism and what we'll call geology in the Bible or whatnot, and today are, at least in our community, seen as much less contentious places. So I think it's not all the same, and we could try to figure out what's driving the differences between these things. But I think that if we look around the range of issues,
is Zionism an example of what you were saying? Organic change on the ground that shifted the halachic norms. Is Zionism perhaps the best example of that, or at least an example?
It's certainly the best example that I can think of something that's like an organized movement, literally.
So how has it changed? How has Zionism changed halacha?
So, I mean, if you go back to why was Orthodoxy classically, right, opposed to Zionism, right? So they were opposed historically, that's right. And that shift over, let's say, the last 60, 70, 80 years. So, this is obviously the subject of, I'm sure Professor Shapiro can give a multi-part lecture series on this, and I'm sure all the nuance he would give is correct. I'm going to not do any of that. And basically it's saying you're redefining the definition of a Jew, that a Jew is someone who keeps Torah and mitzvahs to a Jew, someone who belongs to this nation, and who engages in what we now call the civil religion of Israel. And by the way, I don't think that was wrong. In other words, I think that is what has happened in Israel to a degree. And I think you see this. You see, there's a book published, very influential book, called in English, it translated to Israeli Jew or Israeli Judaism, basically showing that today, more and more, the distinction between observant and non-observant in Israel is not a very meaningful distinction. It's a spectrum question. It is both very easy to keep Shabbat and kosher in Israel, but it's kept differently. The whole sense of identity is completely different. Attitude.
I'm not sure the extent to which these are halachic or meta-halachic, but
arguably more important. And of course, they have halachic expression. So, for example, people are now going up to the Temple Mount. Yes. People are talking about.
That's certainly a change since I was in yeshiva when it was halachic.
Correct. One's attitudes towards people who do not observe halacha, particularly in Israel, right? Conversion. I mean, we could go on, right? All the conversion controversies. They say, listen, you can't think of conversion into a nation state and to belonging to a nation state the same way you think of belonging to a minority. And the whole change from being a minority religion in a hostile, hostile to quasi-hostile to maybe a different non-Jewish environment, to being the majority of which, practice of the specific religion is on a spectrum has I think changed.
Let me ask you something about one of the consequences of Zionism or sovereignty in the land of Israel by the Jewish community. We've confronted a number of economic and civil issues that halacha has had to grapple with. Shemitah is a perfect example. And that has, I think, possibly evoked one of some might see it as a strength, some might see it as a weakness of reform in Jewish law, small r reform. That is, the way that this has been approached is not, as you call it, the declaratory frontal shift, but to use devices to get around the law, such as heter mechira, selling the land to a non-Jew, pruzbul, selling debts to the state so that they're not cancelled by Shemitah. And is that more representative of how reform is effected in Jewish law? That is, by loophole devices, by clever rabbinic Talmudic scholarship, rather than by conceptually asking the question, is this a good law? And why can't we do that? What is it about Jewish law that doesn't permit us to do that? Why do we have to adopt these devices to work around the law with ingenuity rather than reform it?
Sure. So let me just go back there. So I think that the example of Shemitah that you said, the example of first of all, the whole infrastructure of how Shabbos is kept by the state, so to speak, right? That pikuach nefesh now includes having people observe and monitor the sewage system and the drainage system, and and everything the way hospitals work in Israel. In other words,
and Gentiles.
So actually, yes, mixed, right? So that's actually an example. Let's pick on this. This is an old debate, but a very interesting one. It says, okay, and I'm going to get to your question about devices in a moment, but to try to concretize what I mean. So the gullus way of thinking about, it's Shabbos, I need to do something, is you hire a Shabbos guy, right? Comes Zionism and says, what are you talking about? We're a state. We're not going to import a class of citizens whose job it is to make Shabbos work. Now, there are some people around and whatnot, but it's a mix. And what they say is, no, to keep halacha as a state, as a country, as a nation, that is Shomer Shabbat, to one degree or another, means having halachic structures to allow the necessary 7-day-a-week infrastructure of the state to work. And I think the conversion thing is very, very similar, right? Is that you have someone who is born, let's say, to a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother who comes from Russia, who serves in the IDF, who's part of the society, that's going to look different. So I want to say, there are halachic things that the context of state and statehood changes. Now, to your second point, let me flip it to you for a moment as a lawyer and as a secular lawyer. Well, let me first say, in your capacity as a secular lawyer, is it not true that it's much easier for a common law court to distinguish, to minimize, to work around precedents that it's sort of evading, rather than say, hereby today we say A versus B is overruled and C versus D is the law? That does happen occasionally, but very rarely in my experience.
So I was going to come to that because I had this in my court last week, and I brought it back tomorrow just because I made some Heta Mechira-like suggestions to the council. So I'm not breaching any confidence here because this was in open court. We have a particular problem here in Australia with First Nations Australians, Indigenous Australians, and their appalling tragic overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. And so you have people who bring appeals from the multitude of convictions they have in the lower courts, and they bring appeals in the Supreme Court. Anyway, one thing, I have a chap in his early 20s who's in prison, and the government legal service to represent Aboriginal people has found an argument to overturn the original conviction. They're entitled to come to the Supreme Court. We get to the point where it's clear that an error was made, but we want to help this poor chap. I mean, he's heading down a life of crime unless he gets real medical and psychological assistance. We look at the legislation, and it's got all sorts of roadblocks to trying to actually help this guy. So it was quite an unusual case because I almost workshopped with the lawyers to find a way around these roadblocks within the legislation, or preserving the letter of the legislation, even if we were perhaps not exactly observing all its aspects. So yes, we do that in secular law. A judge has to, because a judge can't change the law. A judge has to deal with the law that is before the judge. But I was anticipating you might say that, but I want to debate that with you, because people say, well, all right, that's human law. We expect that fallibility in human law. We expect a judge who's humane and creative to want to be able to work within the law, but around the roadblocks in order to get a solution. But here we're talking about, it's not human law. Here we're talking about the law of the infallible God. We don't expect these deficiencies. Now, that will bring me to a point that I want to raise later that I think is that complaint, I think, is actually quite a fundamental misunderstanding of Jewish law that I'll come to. But in answer to your question, isn't that what a civil lawyer does? Well, yes. But we're talking about, the law of God here. Halacha is supposed to reflect the will of God. And we're less tolerant of these seeming roadblocks or things that lack common sense.
So it's funny because you've now shifted. First you were asking, why not go at it directly? Why grow it at it around? And now, as I take your question, is, of course we can't go at it directly. It's God's law. But how can we even go at it around? So,
well, that's what judges are allowed to do.
Justice, which way are you asking?
You're entirely correct, but that only reflects the complexity of the issue. But I don't actually think that this is, for reasons I'll come to later. I'm just positing what I think is a common conception, and that is, we'll tolerate this in civil law, but it's much more difficult to accept in religious law, in halacha. I don't, for reasons I'll develop later, I think that's wrong. But I'm just responding to your point.
Sure. But I do think that I want to adopt some of what you said. And I think that, whether halacha is radically different in this way than secular systems or not, I think the idea of frontally going against God's law is unimaginable to poskim. It's also unimaginable to the community. And as you've heard me say this a bunch, I think there's this dialectical sense between the rabbinic caste and the communal caste about them working out sort of where the lines are. So I think going against something frontally, or a Saiman in Shulchan Aruch, sort of plain language in the Shulchan Aruch or the codes, going against frontally, I don't want to say it never happens, because it does, but is rare and needs a lot more oomph behind it. I think of this as a sliding scale between the degree to which it's running against well-established, entrenched halachic norms, and the way the community is seeing this change as required, necessary, and consistent.
So let's pick up.
Let me just finish. Consistent
yeah.
with, because I think this is important. Consistent with the religious image it respects and wants to project. It's not that an individual wants to change. It says, do we see ourselves as a religious halachic community that holds this and can continue in our distinctive tradition that way? To me, those are the critical questions. So if we come to Zionism, and certainly the rise and maybe even takeover of religious Zionism, the answer to that has been yes. And therefore, I think various halachic changes, innovations consistent with and promoting the state of Israel and religious Zionism are relatively easy. When it comes to other things, some of the things we mentioned up front, I think that is much harder. And there's much more division internally. And therefore, running up against these norms is much more difficult.
Okay, all right. So that's, I'm going to make it hard for you. You've invited me to do that. I think one of the examples of this organic incremental shift is the bat mitzvah. There's a responsum in Igros Moshe and Rav Moshe Feinstein of Shalom's responsa to a rabbi by the name of Meir Kahana, as it happens, where he writes, is it permissible for a girl to have a bat mitzvah in an Orthodox shul? And he writes, if you do it after davening at the kiddush, in between the herring and it's just, it's just bizarre yesterday. Now, 60 years later, bat mitzvahs are mainstream in shul, at least in modern Orthodox communities and sometimes even in more far-right communities. So a girl getting up, giving a Dvar Torah in shul is mainstream. No one is shocked by that. Right? So we've come from it being unacceptable to it becoming mainstream. Some of that is the influence of egalitarianism generally, the reform movement. So that shift has happened in some of our lifetimes, or just before and now. So that's, I think, an example. But let me ask you this. A woman can be a judge of the Supreme Court of the United States. She can't be a dayan in the Beth Din in Alberta. So how do we grapple with that? Because to many people, that's a bigger issue. And these bat mitzvah, we can see how that incrementally might become acceptable. But how do we tackle the big issues? Women in the public space, egalitarianism more generally.
Right. So, spoiler alert, I'm not going to solve this problem. But let me reflect on it. So let's start with what you said. So I think these are important examples. So the bat mitzvah to me is relatively easy to understand because there's no, as I said, I think that there's a combination of the underlying halachic norm and the degree of communal consensus and need. There's no direct underlying halachic norm that a bat mitzvah violates, right? I assume we're talking about she's not leaning from the Torah, and that's kind of getting, let's do this. She's not leading Mosef, easier. Right, so if you say, okay, what's the formal halachic prohibition against, a young woman getting up in shul and giving a Dvar Torah, you'll find some things here and there, but that's a lower bar. So that's A, I think, to start with the formal law. B, like you said, it is spread, and it also can spread in organic ways. In other words, one shul does it this way, before Kiddush, after Kiddush, with the herring, with the chol, before, right? And then like slowly practice emerges. To your other point, right? A, there is an express halacha in Shulchan Aruch about a woman serving as a dayan. And B, it's hard to see how that happens incrementally. In other words, you're going to need some Beit Din at some point to say, okay, here we are. But now let me push this further. And again, right, let's say, I've asked myself and my students this question. Okay, let's say, and we're going to pick on the Beit Din in Alberta simply because you brought it up. I don't know if such a thing even exists.
I don't know if there is a Beit Din in Alberta. But
okay, so even better, because that way no one will complain that we're saying it. The Beit Din Alberta says, you know what? You're right. You're right. Just Saiman, you're right. It's crazy that a woman could be Chief Justice of Israel, is now a woman, or you know, in the United States, Australia, whatever it is, but not on the Beit Din. So we're going to do that. I asked my people, what do you think will happen? Like in the Orthodox community, what will happen? Okay, good, we did it. What will happen?
Well, the Beit Din will be persona non grata. That's what will happen.
Right. It will, meaning, what does that mean? That means that the community is not going to accept that, right? You can do it, right? There's no law, here means civil law, but like, okay, no one will accept it, or not no one, but none of the people who you're trying to communicate to with this Beit Din, this hypothetical Beit Din. So to me, that's saying, and again, I'm now in observing mode, right? That the community is not ready for it or not willing to accept it or sees this distinction as very essential to its identity. Now we can ask why that is, and that's a more complicated question. But I want to like just start with listing the facts that you can do this, right? It can be done. There is no physical impediment. But what you're really saying is that there is a, we could call it halachic, emotional, spiritual, misogynistic, whatever words you want to put in there, that it won't work. It will not, no one will respect, no one in the world that you're trying to use this Beit Din for will respect its Maaseh Beit Din. So what that's telling me is that there is not just, it's not just the line in Shulchan Aruch, right? It's the way the community understands itself in reference to those lines and to those practices and to the change of those practices. That's the issue, because there are other lines in Shulchan Aruch in the Beit Din space where people are willing to accept deviations from this, right? Shulchan Aruch is full of the fact that in every case, you have to do a shvuah. Okay, I'm actually studying this now. So far as I know, no contemporary Beit Din ever administers a shvuah. Oh no.
Just explain, a shvuah is an oath.
An oath to, so in formal halacha, when you have a fact dispute, most of the time, that should be solved by one party or the other taking an oath, affirming or disaffirming certain things that happen. This doesn't happen. So it's not, to me, the answer is not, there's a line in Shulchan Aruch or not. It's the way that has been processed, accepted.
Professor Saiman, you know what that opens up, that comment invites possibly this response. You're right, Professor Saiman. The rabbis are really good at bending the rules when it comes to financial and economic infrastructure. And when it comes to social and sexual and gender issues, they go the other way. Even when the law permits it, they won't permit it.
So let me push on the they there. That would be my main response. Who's the they? Is the they the rabbis sort of operating independently of the communities that they are leading, and that the communities that are supporting them, and the communities that they're installing them, and the communities that are seeing them as rabbis? Or is there something? So I don't disagree with that description, other than it's not only the rabbis. It's much deeper in the social fabric than that. Now, that doesn't really yet, I want to be clear, does that explain really why we draw this line this way and that way? Not exactly, but it does, in my view, simply looking at this as if we only had different rabbis, I would flip it as, why aren't we producing different rabbis? Why isn't this community generating the authority to it? And I think that's because these questions lay much, much deeper than simply the rabbis. And anyone who knows me knows I am not a shill for defending, but the rabbis, right? But what I'm saying is that it is a much deeper social structure about what the community can see itself doing, how it understands its lines, how it understands its both accommodation and to some degree disassociation with modernity. Why are gender and sexuality issues so contentious? I don't have a full answer to that, and I'd be lying if I told you I do. What I could observe is that these are lines that people will fight about very vehemently. Is there, and today see themselves as some of the core distinctions between them and other groups. Right? I don't think that was even true, right? Let's just go that 200 years ago, we talked about the beginning of reform, right? The egalitarianism was not at all, it was like basically keeping Shabbos and other things like that. Meaning, this is a relatively recent
phenomenon. But I think I want to pick up on something you just said, which I think is quite important, and that is that people see this as an identifying feature of their tradition and a distinguishing feature. And so I've encountered situations where even where there's a halachic solution to accommodate, for example, gender dysphoria and in difficult situations, people don't want to accept a halachic solution to make everybody comfortable if it involves any acquiescence to this notion of gender fluidity. So I think you're right about that. I want to flip to something else which I think has some currency at the moment, and that is there's a growing I think sentiment that I've heard in both academic and religious and less religious circles, and that is the great embodiment of Jewish legal creativity is the Talmud. And the rabbis of the Talmud were able to accommodate, and don't like to use the word manipulate, but they were able to confront and deal with a myriad of situations in a very creative and ingenious way. All that came to an end with a codification of Jewish law through Shulchan Aruch, and the codification of Jewish law has stultified its natural creativity. And we need to move away from our obsession with the codification with Shulchan Aruch and back to the creativity of the Talmud. What do you say to that?
So the first thing I would say is that today there will be, I guess, it'll be the middle of the night for you, but there's a back and forth in this through Harvard Law School's Jewish law program. Professor Ed Fram and my friend Professor Tamar Morsel-Eisenberg will be discussing this. So that's the first thing I'd say. So this is not a new argument. In fact, in the generation around the creation of the Shulchan Aruch, really a little bit later, once it became kind of entrenched, the Maharshal, the Amshel Shlomo, Rav Shlomo Luria, and others of that generation made essentially the same point. They say, Maharshal's, his comments are slightly different. He sort of says halacha is not this kind of thing that can be codified. It's the infinite word of God, and the attempt to put it in a rule book is sort of a disgrace to what it is, which is not exactly the way you framed it, but certainly in line. I think that there is something to that. Although, as you note, every system has to go through. Imagine if we didn't have the Shulchan Aruch, that every time you have to dive back into the, endless, right? In other words, I'm always pretty happy to have someone distill it, right? So, and Professor Twersky 40 years ago sort of made this point that halacha kind of goes in there's a system of expansion, or era of expansion and era of convergence, era of expansion, era of convergence in terms of its sources. So the first thing I would say is I think some sort of organizing normative practices that come together are necessary. in any system, Jewish law included. I'd also say that, and actually Professor Daniel Sperber has a list somewhere I saw of provisions of Shulchan Aruch that many people who would be considered good, valid Orthodox Jews do not adhere to exactly that way. Some of that is reflected in the commentaries around the Shulchan Aruch or in the later works too. So I also want to push back a little bit, that it's not exactly true, right? That just because it's there, it's certainly the starting point, right? And it's certainly where we start. But again, I'd come back to the line in Shulchan Aruch without the social coherence behind it is very thin. Like you said, with many issues in commercial law, or that there are workarounds or whatnot. So I think the workaround point here is also relevant. Is this a workaround that the community collectively wants to get to and supports versus one that it doesn't? Those to me are important questions. And I'm giving a very socio-cultural view of this. It's the way I see it. Somebody would give a very legalistic distinction and tell you exactly why this area is different than this area is different than this area is different than this area. I think that is not irrelevant. I think those points are relevant, but I don't think they're the whole story. Because as you said, there's a tremendous ability to, turn things around and look at it this way and do it this way. And I think that the connection point is where not just a communal sensibility is, but a kind of religiously aspirational sensibility is.
Okay.
Where do we want to be? These issues, now, to your last point, absolutely there is, I don't know what other word to call it, a culture war aspect to this. In other words, once if right now, these certain things are in society at large, right, are dominant within a sort of liberal progressive sector, and orthodoxy by and large is not there, and sometimes, depending where you are, sometimes hostile to it, sometimes indifferent, sometimes skeptical, rarely fully embracing. I think that factors in, but that factors in the level like, right, is that where we want to be? That doesn't make it right, by the way, and I want to be clear here. One could I am describing what I see, right, which is different than what should be, because I think that's for rabbis and communities to work out and let them form. I
want to take it in a slightly different direction to pick up more thematically on where we've gone. And I want to come back to the point I made that I hear from people, and when you challenged me about that's what civil lawyers do and that's what judges do. And I said to you, well, that's because people are much more tolerant of deficiencies or roadblocks in human law than they are in God's law. And I said, that's not a position I agree with, but it's a position I often hear. And I want to come back and also tie it into the coming festival of Shavuot, because I read something, Shtickle Chosid. So I read something, I taught something last night from the Lubavitcher Rebbe that I think is insightful in this way. We've mentioned a couple of times already in this series about Tanur Shalachnai, the famous incident in the Talmud, where I think many people will be familiar with it, but the overview is that there's a dispute among the rabbis, and there's one rabbi against the majority, and God, through all sorts of miracles, and then ultimately by declaratory but kol, a declaratory voice from heaven, sides with the dissenter, the single rabbi, and the majority of rabbis respond by saying, well, who cares what God thinks, effectively. The law is what we say it is, not what God thinks. Now, that says something in many ways very fundamental about Jewish law, but it also says something fundamental about the discussion we're having now. And that is that actually Jewish law is not God-centric. It is human-centric. That's what God wants. And the Talmud goes on to relate, as I'm sure many people know, this mystical tale that when Elijah went to heaven and asked God, what did you think of all of that? God expressed his great pleasure that the Jewish people knew exactly how Jewish law should operate. In other words, if you want a God-centric legal system where reform is effected by a voice that comes out of heaven and declares a new revelation, then you've got the wrong religion. We are not a revelatory religion post-Sinai. We had one revelation, and that revelation was a system, not a prescription for all time. It was a system, and it's the human, it's that system mediated through the human mind that produces Jewish law. So we're not a revelatory religious legal system in that way, or a God-centric declaratory religion. Now, take it or leave it, that's really what Judaism is. Now, if that human-centric concept of law, in other words, God's will but mediated through the human mind and human activity, if that's what Judaism is, then we have to wear the absence of God's declaratory revelation in reform as well. In other words, it's not a matter of God coming out and a voice coming out from heaven and say, well, you idiots, of course a woman can be a dayan in the Beth Din of Alberta. That's not going to happen. That has to happen, if it ever does, incrementally through the medium of our halachic processes, community acceptance, and therefore the human centricity of Jewish law is part of its beauty. Along with that comes a certain sluggishness in reform, because humans are sluggish. And also human reform in law, you don't want that to evolve too quickly, because we've seen the consequences in world history of radical shift in legal systems, often doesn't end well. So my point is that everything you have described actually is theologically very important to a fundamental understanding of law and its human centricity in Judaism.
Yeah, no, and I think it's very important to give the theology of it, which you did, and I think that idea, it actually connects to the comments of the Maharshal of the Yom Shlomo Luria that I talked about before, who really plays on that. And he says something fascinating. It's not original to him, but he says that at Sinai, he says when Hashem gave the Torah, good Shavuos Torah, he says, and he's quoting Kabbalistic sources, that there were like an infinite number of channels. He calls them sinorot, right? And that each soul, he basically says, look, God is infinite. How does the infinite talk to the finite? So he says everybody hears the Torah of their soul, and that there were like 49 different channels, and maybe that's just a metaphor for, per the number of people, and that each person hears it per his soul. And to him, this is like the definition of how an infinite talks to a finite, is sort of giving a channel specifically to a person. And then he says, well, then which one is the right answer? And then he goes in the direction that you suggested, that it's what Moshe Halbertal calls constitutive. In other words, at the unfolding of Jewish history, it reveals that which of these various tubes or sinorot or channels that happen, that sort of God ultimately wants. I think that's a very important theological side. Now, of course, there are other people who argue, right, on that theology, but I think it's certainly well sourced and certainly part of our.
Well, I'll just add, because the Hasidic aspect is that the Baal Shem Tov, so I understand, particularly cherished second day Shavuos, and one of the reasons is because the 7th of Sivan was the date of Matan Torah according to Rabbi Yossi in the Gemara. Won't get into the whole Gemara, that's the overview. The reason that according to Rabbi Yossi that the Torah was given on the 7th and not was the 6th was because Moshe Rabbeinu, of his own initiative, added an extra day to the days of preparation of the Jewish people for Matan Torah. So the Baal Shem Tov saw in Rabbi Yossi's view a more human, a greater level of human initiative in the determination of the date of Matan Torah. It was more human. And therefore, he cherished second-day Yom Tov more. So and he used to have a special, so that's a very Chassidish word, but it's the same. It's really fundamentally the same concept.
It is. And what I'd add is that, I always think about the central text of Jewish law, of course, is the Gemara. Now, the Gemara is sort of maddening in a number of ways, but in its way of dealing with authority, right? On the one hand, anytime you have a Mishnaic statement or a Talmudic statement or whatnot, it is taken as the authority from which everything else flows and has to match. On the other hand, anyone who's learned a page of Gemara knows that it's not so difficult for it to be turned around and inside out and upside down. And to me, it's like it's not by mistake that has become the central Jewish text, because it is at the one time constantly affirming the authority of its tradition in ways that are, the whole thing makes no sense unless the halachot are binding and the earlier sources are binding, right? The project makes no sense. On the other hand, it's always sort of, in some ways, doing a little bit of the opposite as well. And, to your code point, I always believe that while the codes are important, there's a reason why the base text is the Gemara and the Talmud, because it encapsulates this sort of like dialectical tendency between the authority of the tradition and the sort of real-time human working at it. Have we reached are we right now at a place of imperfect balance? I think in some areas, definitely. Do these get worked out? I hope so. We do see, looking historically, that things that were once burning issues, and to me, I take, again, the question of evolution and creationism, which not just for Jews, but 150 years ago was like thought to threaten the entire edifice of every religion. And today you sort of say, okay, 6 days, 6 billion years, whatever. We do have this capacity to kind of get over these things. I do hope that we do find resolutions, and maybe better resolutions than we're on now. I don't think
we have a question. I wanted to go to one of the questions that has come in. And someone's asked, I wonder how many opportunities there are for communities to discuss with their rabbi and actually accept changes which are quite acceptable in the general community. And so what's the process by which the people, the decision makers, the rabbis, are connecting with their communities in order to understand where the community is? So if reform is organic and it emerges in the community and the decision makers within the community, or the practitioners in the community, where is that opportunity? Where's that forum for that interchange, so that the rabbis or the leaders can be sensitive to changes that are important to people, or to issues that are important to people?
Sure.
In Australia, we have a very rude awakening to some of these issues with the Royal Commission into Sexual Abuse of Children and domestic violence. And so some of these things have confronted the Jewish community and the halachic community.
And not just the Jewish
community. Very
harsh.
Right? Yeah, correct. Well, that's right. That's important. But the idea of, let's take Moser, Masira, the Moser, that's undergone complete 180-degree change halachically, because halacha has had to adapt to an inescapable social norm that these people are evil and have to be reported to the police. Well, evil tendencies, however one wishes to put it. So that's another example of reform, really. But apart from that's the big bang reform, in the sense that the halachic community has to confront that and has to absorb it and deal with it. But
let me push on that, because it's decided Shulchan Aruch Halacha that someone who's a danger to the community should be reported to the secular authorities. This is 16th century law. Now, what has changed is our perception of who is dangerous to the community, right? In other words, but there, I think there's actually
also our perception has changed as to the nature of the authorities to which
which it should, right? Yeah. It should. I mean, I think to go the other way, sometimes in some of these things in and around courts, and we talked about this last week, you read and it's like as if we're living in 17th century Poland. And there's, I think, a lack of recognition that we live in democracies where we are not just equal, but in the United States, Orthodox Judaism is a important and impressive political force, even though people say no, we're not. I disagree. So I definitely think that some things are off kilter. But
So
to try
let me
to
come back
answer
to
the
your
question,
point.
let's try to answer the question.
Go on.
So about where this happens. So this can happen. I don't see the primary location of this as a parlor meeting on a Wednesday night where the rabbi comes and assembled members of the community talk. But let's take the bat mitzvah example that you brought up, which I think is a good. So people try different. I think it's like a negotiation process. People say, I want to do this, and the rabbi says, maybe ask me. Now, even the rabbi himself, what's he thinking? He's thinking halachically. He's thinking, how will my peers evaluate it? How will my Rosh Yeshiva think about this? So in other words, it's not just like this rabbi himself is also in actual and metaphoric conversation. And now we know there are WhatsApp chats, there are groups. I'm on some of these where rabbis are discussing these between themselves with their Rosh Yeshivas, so there's, and then, okay, we did this, and how does that look, and how are people responding to that, and does that feel like consistent with who we are? And then we move it up, and then you get, that's too much, right? And then this gets sort of negotiated over time and over what's happening in your shul and the other shuls that are like your shuls and the other shuls that are like the shuls that are like your shuls. And then in Israel, it might be a little different, in America might, and I think like these things sort of get slowly negotiated.
I want to pick up on a point you made a few minutes ago, and that is that in Masira, with the Mosa, with sexual abuse, one of the things that has changed is our perception of who is a danger to the community. And that's a very important point because culturally, historically, pedophilia and its dangers were unappreciated or undetected, not just by the Jewish community, but by the broader community at large for centuries. But it wasn't the Jewish community that identified this problem. It was the non-Jewish community.
Correct.
And I think there's nothing wrong with us saying halacha will respond to social norms, including, if you like, the evolution of human sensitivities that emerge from the non-Jewish community. Those things are perfectly, not only are they perfectly fine, but that's part, if you like, theologically, of God's plan to build in that human-centric flexibility into Jewish law. We will respond to social norms even if we didn't discern them. And I
agree completely.
And one of the difficulties, I think, is that people approach Jewish law as if Jewish law is this hafach ba kikul ba, as if we have to have a complete understanding of the total gamut of human morality. And if it's not important in Jewish law, it's not important.
Well, let me take that one step further. So I'll give an example. 30 years ago, there was very little discussion about mental health in the Orthodox community. Today, there is, particularly in the more Haredi community, there's almost an industry of mental health professionals and just talk. You could walk in any Frum bookstore, and the books in the back will be all the learned books, and the books in the front will be all the books about.
Rabbi Rosenzweig has just written a book about halacha and mental health, by the way.
No, that's an exceptional book in a different way, because that's the halacha mental health.
Yeah.
But I was at a talk very recently by someone definitely more from the right-wing community who basically gave he's a social worker, and basically gave a secular mental health talk. That's its, and then found midrashim, sources, etc., and delivered it. And if you didn't know, this is just a standard Frum talk that would have been given 200 years ago in the shtetl. Of course, completely untrue. So I think there's an example, and I think everything you said is right. There's an example of something that emerges from, we'll call it non-Jewish society, that then kind of gets filtered through and then often refracted through and then reframed in the language of Jewish law and Jewish sources, and that makes it penetrable. And that allows it, so as one could be cynical about this process, and sometimes I am, but if I'm now going to be more positive about this process, what's happening is you're giving the language to allow a firm community to say, oh, this is part of our system, this is important, we don't invest our resources.
But my argument is that's not b'diavad. That is precisely what the Jewish legal system is designed to be able to do. Anyway, I think we've now schmoozed our way to an hour. Professor Saiman, I think we have to hand back. I think you and I could keep schmoozing for a long time, but people, I think, have a few other things.
Sure, but I do want everyone to end with really what you said, which is the theological aspect to me is especially here right before Shavuot, when we think about Matan Torah, and there's lots of Torah, Hasidish and otherwise, about this point, right? God spoke, everyone ran away, right? And then, no, Moshe's got to come back, and it becomes, right, or the difference between the first Luchot, which are written by God, and the second Luchot written by Moshe. In other words, there's many indications and sources, and we've touched on some of them, that are all sort of hinting at this process that hopefully we've opened up a little bit for the Elam.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think Rabbi Eldon, back to you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Solomon and Rabbi Saiman. Personally, I was very disappointed that we hadn't solved all of the issues I raised at the beginning in the last hour, but maybe a second hour would have done that perhaps, but 1 hour isn't quite enough.
You're of the three of us, you're the professional rabbi, so you're the one who has to, that's the conclusion. You're the one who has to solve them. We can talk about them.
I'll fix it over the weekend.
We're just the guys on the balcony observing. You're the actor.
Right. I want to thank both of our interlocutors for a really fascinating discussion. Really a privilege to listen to it. I hope it'll start more conversations here in Sydney and in Australia more generally. And these issues which we have to grapple with, both for their own sake, the Shema, and also because they're so pressing and so important and so practical in so many ways. And I think it's essential to go from the nitty-gritty, the front line, back to the principles and theological underpinnings. Otherwise, we're going to get completely lost and lose our way. And that's what this conversation has really contributed so effectively over these past 3 sessions. I want to thank all of the rabbis and congregations who have supported this series. I want to thank everyone who's joined on the Zoom call, and hope that we'll have more of these sort of conversations in the future. We wish everyone a Chag Sameach and happy cheesecake, and please we'll learn again together in good health.
Chag Sameach. Thank you.
Chag Sameach.